between the state and federal government. So I encourage you to ask questions. I encourage you to take notes. And there is truly no question that is not worth asking. So have no shame or fear. And if you don't understand something, please feel free to ask it out loud, because somebody else probably also wants to know too. Okay?
Yeah. And my name is Green. Nice to meet everybody. The truth is, I have a lot of information. It can be a little bit overwhelming. So if I'm moving too fast, feel free to just raise your hand, ask me to explain things differently or in better detail. I'm happy to do that. I started asking already, what's everybody hoping to get out of today? And this is meant to be a very basic primer on how our government works. But if anybody has anything specific that they'd like me to focus on, I'm happy to detail it. Does anybody have any specific questions, or please?
I mean, just following the news, we are living in interesting times. For the first time, as far as I can tell, now we're seeing the federal government being at odds with local governments, specifically on issues like immigration. And we heard the announcement from both the federal and the state government taking opposing views about protecting immigrants. So it will be interesting to highlight, when we discuss the difference between the two, how that's going to play out in the next months and 4 years, and also what does it all mean to immigrants and to people in this country. And also, as a Palestinian community, we are looking at the situation in Palestine, and we would like to give, at least myself, would like to understand the influence point in both local, state, and federal governments when it comes to pushing the cause of Palestine.
Of course, yeah. Anybody else have anything specific that they're interested in, anything that they want me to focus on?
Mostly state,
Mostly
how
state?
that works, and do you talk about Board of Education as well, or not?
Not in this presentation, but that's actually local elections, but you do have an opportunity to vote in local elections as well. I can talk about that for a little bit at the end. I'm going to start with just a little bit of history that's not really all that important, just to give a little bit of context so you understand better how the relationship between the federal government and the state government works. In 1776, 13 colonies of England got together and they decided that they were going to write a letter to the king listing their grievances and declaring their independence for that reason. This was not all the colonies of England. Canada didn't rebel, and the British Virgin Islands didn't rebel, Jamaica didn't rebel, and it led to the American Revolution. Now, during the war, the relationship between all of these different colonies was guided by a document called the Articles of Confederation, which talked about how they would share responsibility for raising armies and things like that. Ultimately, after the war ended, it was not a long-term solution. So what they ended up doing was getting rid of what was called the Articles of Confederation and coming up with the United States Constitution. And what that means is that these 13 independent states have given up certain rights and responsibilities to the federal government. Think of it like the European Union. You have all of these different countries, and they have given up their right to have monetary policy. In the case of the United States, certain other rights that we'll talk about in just a moment. Here I have listed just some of the federal powers and state powers. These are the big ones. The federal government is exclusively in charge anytime you are participating in interstate commerce. If you're dealing with commerce in two different states, it is interstate commerce. Foreign policy is entirely the responsibility of the federal government. So is immigration. States are not allowed to have their own immigration policy. What some states do is they create zones or sanctuary cities, is what they're sometimes called, where enforcement is limited. Where if you get pulled over and you are undocumented, then you don't have, you aren't immediately surrendered to naturalization services. Monetary policy. every state doesn't have their own individual currency. We all use dollars. And any powers that are necessary in order to put into effect the powers that were granted to the federal government. So for example, if the government, let's say the government has the power to regulate immigration, they're also allowed to form ICE in order to further those goals. And it's a setup of, in this case, a border wall is within the rights of the federal government, not the state. Now, the state is in charge of intrastate commerce, meaning any commerce that takes place entirely within the state is the responsibility of that state to regulate. Health policy, education policy, welfare programs that are meant to care for people who are sick or who don't have money. These are all administered by the state. Administering elections is the purview of the states. And any powers not specifically granted to the federal government all belong to the state. Now, there are a couple exceptions. The federal government oftentimes uses funding to control state policy. And the easiest example I can give you is the drinking age. In every state around the country, the drinking age is 21. And the reason for that is because the federal government controls a lot of money that goes towards building and maintaining roads. And if the states didn't agree to raise their drinking age to 21, then they weren't going to get their money for the roads. The other thing to point out is that people take the judges who decide these things take a very broad view of what interstate commerce means. If you run a restaurant in Mississippi, you are not allowed to discriminate who you serve in that restaurant based on race, religion, or ethnicity, because you could, in theory, have a patron that comes in from out of state, and all of a sudden it becomes interstate commerce. So if you have any sort of public accommodation, any business that serves the public, you are still subject to a lot of federal laws, even if all of your customers are in the state of New Jersey. You are simultaneously a citizen of both your state and the federal government. So you have the right to vote. You have the obligation to pay taxes. You have the obligation to follow laws. And when there is a conflict between a state law and a federal law, the federal government always has supremacy. The federal law is always going to take precedence over the state law. The best example of this that I can give you is marijuana. It is legal in the state of New Jersey, but the federal government still has a law making marijuana illegal. It is within the rights of the federal government to do a raid. The FBI could do a raid on a dispensary in Montclair if they wanted to. But the FBI has better things to do. And I remember in the early days of the Bush administration, when medicinal marijuana was brand new in California, they actually did raid a couple of medicinal marijuana dispensaries back then, arrested a lot of people. To this day, it's very difficult for the people who run those dispensaries to maintain bank accounts and accept credit cards for that reason, because it's still illegal under federal law.
Can I ask a quick question?
Of course.
So currently, right now, one of the things that we're working on in coalition with another organization is the Voting Rights Act. So we're looking to codify that in the state of New Jersey.
Yeah.
And it's not codified on the federal level. What happens if we codify it on the state level, the VRA, but not on the federal level?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was, what happens if the state passes a law that the federal government doesn't pass? So in this case, as long as it's not in conflict with any other law in the federal government, it's fine. The state can enforce it as they see fit. They're the ones who are in charge of administering these elections, and they're within their rights to pass a law dealing with how to regulate those elections. But if the federal law had a law, any provision of the law was in conflict with the federal law, then the federal law would be the higher priority. Does anybody else have any questions before? Of course.
So, two things. One, in that case, it would be something like the regulation of certain healthcare, like I'm thinking HRT, especially on a federal level, so those substances are Schedule I drugs, but on the state level, in some states, it's more of a like hormone treatment for people with various needs. The question I had though was, you mentioned the 14th Amendment on the slide with interstate commerce. I didn't quite catch the connection there.
Yeah, that's on me. The question is, what does the 14th Amendment have to do with this idea of? I'll go back to the slide. What does the 14th Amendment have to do with the federal government's power over the states? The part of the 14th Amendment is a part that says that that states are not allowed to limit the rights of citizens of the United States. So up until the 1860s, the federal government wasn't allowed to prohibit your free speech. But if a state were to limit your free speech, that would have been okay. After the 14th Amendment, the right of the state to limit your free speech was no longer there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just thinking in terms of like the executive.
So the same is true here. So if let's say for the sake, and what we're facing right now is the federal government limiting our rights. That doesn't mean that the state can't give us more rights. So, for example, if let's say within the state of New Jersey has a law protecting hormone therapy for people who have those needs, then it is up to the state of New Jersey to raise the funds to provide that, if that's something that is built into that law, or to defend that as they see fit. As long as it isn't in conflict with a federal law, it shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, and the use of the 14th Amendment there, especially it happening after slavery and that
Yeah.
being personhood.
Yeah, so the 14th Amendment is really more about the federal government making sure that the states don't limit citizens' rights. But it doesn't work the other way.
Okay.
So the federal government can limit your rights, but not the state.
Well, they both set a floor, right? So the federal government sets the floor of what anyone's allowed to do. The state can raise that floor, but they can't go any lower in terms of what rights you have. So, for example, I'm going to use, we'll use, what can I use as an example? Freedom of speech. The right to free speech in the United States has in every single state has a baseline. Each individual state can give you more rights regarding your free speech than that, but they can't give you any fewer rights, right? So in this case, when we're talking about hormone therapy or access to health care, right to an abortion, whatever it is, they can't require they can't require you to they can't require the individual states to go below what or to go above what the federal government requires, but they cannot force the state to come down to the level of what the federal government requires.
So each new president can modify some of the federal laws?
Yeah, we'll get to more of that in a second. But yes, to some extent, yes. That's what Trump has been doing in the last 48 hours with these executive orders. I'll talk more about what the executive orders are and how they work in just a moment. All right. But first, I want to talk about Congress. Now, a lot of this talk is going to be about Congress. Congress is a huge bureaucracy, and it's designed to move slowly and not to get a lot of things done. Congress is where all laws are passed, or they're supposed to be passed. Both the federal and state government have a similar structure. They have two different bodies in the federal government, it's the House of Representatives and the Senate. Those two together make up Congress. There's an executive. In the federal government, it's the president. In the state government, it's the courts, or it's the governor. And then you have the courts, the federal courts and the state courts. Again, we'll talk about all these in just a moment. The built into the system is a set of checks and balances that are meant to prohibit one side of the government, one of these three branches, from having too much power. And as I go through as I'm going through the presentation, I'll talk more about what these checks and balances are. But it's important to note that in the current government that we have, there is one party that controls all three branches of the government. So there aren't a lot of these checks and balances in place right now. All right. So the legislative branch has the power to write the law. They have the power of the purse. They control all the money that runs through the government. If you need funding, if the president needs funding for anything, they need to ask Congress. This is one of those checks and balances I was just talking about. The House of Representatives represents the people. So each district in the House of Representatives is meant to have about the same number of people living in that congressional district. There are 435 congressional districts, which means 435 members of the House of Representatives, and they each serve a 2-year term. Every 2 years, you vote for your congressman or your congressperson. Senate represents the states. Now, what that means is regardless of what the population of the state is, you have the same number of senators in each state. Because there's 50 states, there's 100 senators, and they have 6-year terms. In order to become a law, a bill, which is what you call a prospective law, must pass a majority of both houses of Congress. Meaning, first it goes to the House, and more than half the House has to say, yes, we want that to be the law. Then you take it to the Senate, and more than half the Senate has to agree, yes, we want that to be a law. Then it goes to the president.
First goes where?
Well, it can start in the House or the Senate, with one exception. Tax bills have to start in the House. But it has to go to both of them. Both of them have to agree separately that it is going to be a law. In the Senate, a single senator can stop a bill from being voted on by a process called a filibuster. And besides being a silly word, a filibuster is when one senator just gets on the floor of the Senate and talks. And the rules of the Senate, and this is a rule that can be changed fairly easily, but it's been a long-standing rule. The rule of the Senate is that as long as that person is talking, you cannot force them to sit down unless you have 60 people in the Senate to say sit down. That person can sit there and read a phone book or the dictionary. There was a senator a few years ago who read the book Green Eggs and Ham just to kill a bill because they didn't like it. And again, all bills related to federal taxes have to start in the House of Representatives. There are some important roles in the legislature. The most important is probably the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader. Yeah, go ahead.
Question about the filibuster.
Yeah.
So is the filibuster a process, is it a process utilized through the Senate, or is it a strategy that is utilized by individual senators?
Both.
So it is a written practice and strategy.
It's been used. There's actually a really famous movie about it with Jimmy Stewart from the 1930s called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It's actually worth watching, even though it's old. In that case, there was a really bad bill that was going in front of the Senate, and all the senators were corrupt. And Mr. Smith said, "There's no way I'm going to let this happen." And he just stood up there and he just kept talking until he was exhausted and he falls over. Sorry, I spoiled the movie for you, but it's been almost 100 years. But the point is that that's how it is often used. And then on the other side, sometimes just the threat of the filibuster is enough to kill the bill. Sometimes a group of senators get together and they say, listen, they don't have 60 votes. They're not going to be able to put this bill up for a vote. We're going to just say we're going to filibuster. And then this bill, we're not even going to bother with this bill. Sometimes they don't even go through the pageantry of standing up there and speaking. Sometimes they do, but it's boring either way.
A bit of a juvenile question, but one that's just that I've been thinking. So for the process of a senator filibustering for example, a bill that would be to expand healthcare, for example, what would happen if another senator just went up there and knocked them out?
I mean, the senator could be charged with assault.
Well, yes, but like, would that not put an end to the filibuster in practice?
I mean, in theory, but it would also not start the voting process. You know, like that would stop the whole action on the Senate. It would defeat the purpose.
Okay.
Yeah, everybody would stop and there would be police involved and it wouldn't go well. And the goals wouldn't be achieved. Yes, please.
So is there a limit as how long the filibuster can go on?
Days.
Days?
There's no actual time limit. Sometimes people will stay up in the night. There will be no one left in the building and they'll just be standing there talking.
So it's a question of who has the
Stamina.
stamina, exactly.
Stamina and endurance, yeah.
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 It's an episode of Parks and Recreation too. She does it on Parks and Rec.
Yeah. Anything else? Any other questions on this?
One more. So the filibuster, does that apply only in the federal and state or every level?
It's only in the Senate.
Only in the Senate?
It's only in the Senate. There is no filibuster in the House of Representatives.
Wow.
And the reason I bring it up is to point out, again, I was talking about the bureaucracy of Congress and how difficult it is to get things done. Sometimes it can take one person to block a bill. So the important roles of the legislature, the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader are the leaders of the majority party in Congress. They are the ones who set the agenda for that House of Representatives. So that if the Speaker of the House decides what bills the House is going to vote on that day. Same with the Senate Majority Leader. The minority parties, the Democrats also have a minority leader in the House and the Senate, but they have less of a say in terms of what the agenda is. The President Pro Tem of the Senate is a largely ceremonial role. They're the oldest serving senator, or the longest serving senator, I should say, with the majority party. And they are really only important if the President, Vice President, and the Speaker of the House all die, they become the President. The whip is an interesting position because the whip's job is to reach out to every single member of their party and make sure they're voting in line with what the party wants them to vote. And committee chairs, we'll talk about committees in just a moment, but does anybody have any questions about this? No? Hakeem Jeffries is the House Minority Leader, and the Speaker of the House is Mike Johnson, currently. All right. So, before it becomes a bill, a House starts in committee. There are a lot of different committees that focus on things like the environment, on commerce, on taxes, on the judiciary, and our local Congress people all serve on several of these committees. And the members of the committees are all apportioned by their party leadership. If a majority of the committee does not approve of the bill, then it doesn't move forward to the floor of Congress. It dies right there. The committee chair determines what the agenda is, and the most important committees in Congress are the Judiciary Committee, the Appropriations Committee, and the Ways and Means Committee. The Appropriations Committee and the Ways and Means Committee do the same thing. They're in charge of money and how money is distributed. That's why they're seen as the most powerful. But one is in the House, one is in the Senate. Questions?
There's somebody in the chat that
Yeah.
was watching the live that wanted to ask a question.
Of course.
About checks and balances. Is that okay?
Yeah, I can back up.
They wanted to know like what can be done about APAC and its grab on elected officials. There is no checks and balances when it involves,
Yeah.
like, I guess campaign finances.
Yeah, that has more to do with lobbying. And the truth is that if The best thing to do is to be active, to reach out to your congresspeople. As I said before, foreign policy is the purview of the federal government. So what you really want to do is reach out to your representatives in the House of Representatives. I know in Clifton, is it Mikey Sherrill?
Yeah, well, for Clifton,
Yeah.
the representative, yeah, Nellie Poe,
So yeah, reach out to your congressional representative. Reach out to your senators. The senators in New Jersey are Cory Booker and now Andy Kim. Call them, email them. You won't speak to them personally, but they do keep a log of everybody who calls and emails, and it does matter, even if it feels like it doesn't. The fact that AIPAC has such influence is because they have been doing it for such a long time, and they have so much money behind them. So the goal is to match their intensity.
yeah, whenever we have meetings, we hear a lot of the times that the other side is constantly calling them and constantly pressuring them, and that they don't let up, and they tell us to do the same. Like that is a lot of what we hear in these legislative meetings that we have, is that it's just like an influx of calls and letters and emails. So when we're telling you something, you'll hear at PAC, sometimes we'll send out a text message or an email, and we'll say that something's in committee and we're trying to combat it, or it's gonna be voted on the assembly or the Senate. That's us trying to get as many people as possible to build a testimony, which is what we're gonna have a workshop about that as well.
All right. The U.S. Constitution, what I talked about before, is the guiding document that governs how the states relate to one another, and some very specific rights that cannot be changed. The only way to amend the Constitution is for both houses of Congress to give 2/3 members votes. This becomes nearly impossible as the country becomes more and more polarized. It just the last time it happened was in 1992, and it had to do with congressional compensation. The first 10 amendments was known as the Bill of Rights, and this was freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of against unreasonable searches and seizures. This is right to bear arms is in there as well. 13 through 15 were passed after the Civil War, and these were only possible because the senators from the South weren't allowed to participate. But those have to do with the prohibition on slavery, the rights of individuals to vote, former slaves to vote, and the rights of those former slaves not to be abridged by the states. 18 was prohibition on alcohol, 21 was the repeal of that prohibition, 19 was the woman's right to vote. And like I said, this is something that people talk about amending the Constitution, but realistically, to get 2/3 of the country to agree on something is very unlikely. New Jersey's, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So that's the process for amending the Constitution, but even though it's a different country, in 2017, 2018, Chile had a crisis where they had to rewrite the entirety of the Constitution. What would the conditions be in the United States for something similar to occur, if it is even possible?
It is possible, yeah. The question was, could we rewrite the entire U.S. Constitution? And the answer is yes. That is the other way that the Constitution can be amended, is to have a brand new constitutional convention and start over from scratch and see what comes out. But everything would be on the table. That's the risk. Everything from freedom of speech to the right to bear arms, all of it would be on the table if we had another constitutional.
And that would be dictated by our current elected officials. Like,
Yes.
those would be the writers of the new Constitution. It's who we have in power currently.
Exactly. Those same people who are in power now would be the ones who would.
And they would have to be the ones to force the rewriting of the Constitution.
They would be the ones voting to start it over again. Yes.
Yeah, where that's terrifying.
Which would still have to have the 2/3 majority.
they would need 2/3 majority to agree to a new constitutional convention, and then we would see what would happen. It would all be up in the air. All right. So the New Jersey State Legislature also has two houses. They have the Assembly, which is the equivalent of it's the lower house, and the State Senate, which is the upper house. The State Senate has 40 members and have 4-year terms, and the General Assembly has 80 members and 2-year terms. Most people who are state representatives do it part-time. They are probably much more accessible than your congressional representatives because they have a much smaller constituency base. So if you were to reach out to them, you might actually be able to talk to them about whatever it is that you're concerned. They don't really have any sort of influence over foreign policy or immigration. But if it comes to access to services or needing to having run across like a problem in your day-to-day life that you think a new law could change, they are a really good resource. And I've listed the names of the assembly people and the state senator for Clifton specifically. And over here you can see a map of all of New Jersey's districts.
Not foreign policy, but there are certain bills, like the weapon sales, or Bernie
Yeah.
Sanders had like a series of bills where where they were advocating. We were in meetings with Booker's office and Andy Kim's office to try to stop the sale of offensive weapons, not defensive weapons, but offensive weapons. And that would be an instance in which you could pressure both those state senators in trying to support Bernie Sanders' stopping of offensive weapons. So that's where it will go into foreign policy, or not policy.
Not
but
foreign policy, but yeah. For
Politics.
so most gun regulation is at the state level, mostly because federal gun regulations don't really exist. They could in theory, but they don't. But New Jersey has very strict gun laws, and if and the result is that we have less violence in public places than a lot of other states does. A lot of people talk about gerrymandering that's a buzzword, but I want to make sure people know what it means. Gerrymandering is a really creative way to draw districts up to make sure that one side wins. So if you look at that first map, we're picturing an imaginary state that's a rectangle in shape that is 60% Democrat and 40% Republican. So if you were to draw the lines vertically on that first map, you would get 5 districts, and 3 of them would be Democrat and 2 of them would be Republican. It would match the makeup of the state's political beliefs. If you draw the districts horizontally, the way they are on the second map, all 5 districts would be Democrats, and none of them would be Republican. And if you draw the map in this way, the way it is on the third map, 3 of the districts would be Republican and 2 of them would be Democrat. Even though 60% of the state voted Democrat, the Republicans would still have a majority of the seats. Now, this has been decided that there is nothing illegal about this. There is nothing wrong with doing this. This is just part of politics in America at this point.
Do you know Dennis Kucinich?
Yeah.
So is that what they did to him? Because he was very
Sort of,
pro-Arab in Cleveland, and then they got
changed
rid of him.
They changed the lines of his district so that he was competing against another very popular liberal, and all of a sudden, it didn't make sense. Only one of them could win, and I think he lost his race.
So that's what they did to him.
Yes, but
But
not
the
just.
aligned
It happens in a lot of different states. To some extent, it happens in New Jersey. North Carolina has a really bad case of it. But what ends up happening is even in the whole of Congress, even when most of the country votes for the Democratic Party because of the way the district is set up, the Republicans still end up holding more seats in Congress. That's just the way the system is built, and the courts have decided that it is legal. Doesn't mean that they can't put in a law to change that.
But does it make sense to make it legal? Because it's not fair. I mean,
No, it's not fair.
But that's where we come in. That's where your voice comes in. This is why we want to have this class. The more we learn, the more we can start to petition and organize and mobilize around what we want to see. You can write a bill. You can write a bill and you can ask somebody to support that bill. It's not exclusive. And that's the point of what we're doing with civic engagement at the center, is destigmatizing how exclusive politics is. So that's where we come into play. There are ways to pressure for things to change. Like in 2018, those questions on the voting ballot that says yes or no? In 2018, it was a question on the ballot as to whether or not we wanted to have ranked choice voting. So we complain a lot about the two-party system, but if we change the way we vote, we change the two-party system. So ranked choice voting is you get to pick 5 people instead of one or the other, right? Or one person. What that then does is it allows for other parties to come into play. Now, a lot of people didn't know what that was, so they didn't vote. They didn't vote yes or no. A lot of people just left that question blank, which is why that didn't change in New Jersey. But it's still an option. So the more that we learn the details like this, the more we can mobilize and petition for things to reshape and change. I see the governing body as a physical body, but we're all sharing it. So the more we practice political health on a regular basis and be engaged daily in our different ways, not just the way you eat or the way you work out, with all different things, then we can reshape our governing body and make it a healthier system for all of us.
And I just brought up New Jersey's districts back up on here, just so you can see that it's not a perfect map here. There are some spots that stick out a little bit. There are some spots that get a little skinnier and a little wider. New Jersey it's not the worst offender of any state, but New Jersey definitely has some gerrymandered districts. Oh, and on the New Jersey Constitution, the state of New Jersey has its own constitution, and that is amended regularly by vote at the ballot box. Oftentimes you'll see an initiative on the ballot box when you go to vote, and whether you want to amend the New Jersey Constitution.
So as of recently, something that has just been passed is the getting rid of the party lines.
Yeah.
So our ballot looks very different than other state ballots. But that's a different thing that we can get into at a whole other time. But it is possible it does change. But that is something that organizations did mobilize around to make our elections more fair, so that your vote isn't leading based off of name recognition. So you're not voting for somebody else just because they're on the same line as somebody else that you recognize. It changes it so that it gives other people an opportunity. Let's say you have a rogue Democrat that doesn't really follow all the Democratic norms in New Jersey. They still have a shot at winning by changing the way that it's written out.
I'm sure you have a question.
So I have a question about the ballot questions.
Yeah.
I get the feeling that when I go to vote, it's there, but I didn't have enough notice to learn more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question was, when you get to the ballot box and you see there's a question to vote on, but you don't really have time to research it and to understand what the question actually is. So keep an eye on your mail in the weeks leading up to the election, because you'll receive a sample ballot. And on that sample ballot, you'll see whatever the ballot questions are then. So in the weeks leading up to an election, you should be able to see what the questions are. And sometimes the language can be really confusing, and sometimes it's confusing on purpose, and sometimes it's confusing by accident because the people writing it didn't do a great job. what I'll tell you is read them carefully and do your research ahead of time on those ballot questions because they are important. They are very important.
And you can always,
That's mandated to give us a sample ballot?
you can, that, if, let's say you don't get it in the mail because maybe you have like a different address and you're not a registered voter or something, whatever, something weird with the mail. Let's say you don't get it in the mail, you can literally just Google sample ballot in your county and it'll give you the website for your county election website and you can download your sample ballot. I'm a big pusher of the sample ballot because it allows for you to do the research and be a better informed voter.
And not just about the ballot questions, but about a lot of the lower ballot races like school board. Because a lot of times you get to the ballot box and you see these names running for school board, you have no idea who they are and what they stand for. But if you've seen the sample ballot ahead of time, you have an opportunity to look into them and see what are they actually promoting.
Also, if you register to get your ballots through the mail, you'll always get your ballot in the mail, and then you can just you can fill out the ballot right then and there as you're doing the research as well. So there are ways, there are alternative options than just going to the ballot box on election day.
Any other questions before we move on from legislature in general? Yes.
So I have a question about the local elections.
Yeah.
This past year we had, I think it was the town council, and there was two people running. One was an incumbent, one that's already been there. He was rerunning to be reelected, and there was a new person. So I really liked the newer person, but the guy that ran previously that was already there got elected, and I just think it's because of name recognition.
Yeah.
Because the guy didn't have enough money and he couldn't promote himself, and it was just sad.
It's really, really common. They've actually done studies on this, and they've seen that when they put just random names on the ballot to see who would win, they found that a popular realtor, because they have their name plastered all over town, was more likely to win. Sometimes just recognizing the name is enough for somebody to win, which is why it's important to be informed.
And when there are local county races, pay attention to what's happening at PAC because we have candidate forums. And when you can come to the candidate forums, you can ask questions directly to the candidates. And that is the best way to get to know who you want to support.
So the executive branch of the government is the President of the United States and all of the departments below him. The President serves a 4-year term. They are not permitted to serve more than 2 terms. They must be at least 35 years old, and they have to be born in the United States. The primaries are administered by the Democrat and Republican parties and are not governed by any federal rules. All the rules of the primaries are the rules of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. They can do whatever they want. And the president is not elected directly by the people. They're elected by what's called the Electoral College. And this can be confusing. Each state gets a certain number of electoral votes, and the number of electoral votes they have is the number of congressional representatives. So New Jersey has 14 electoral votes because they have 12 congressional representatives and 2 senators. The electors have never voted against the candidate that their state votes for. But again, because the system is designed this way, it is possible for someone to lose the popular vote, but still win the electoral vote and become the president of the United States. It happened with George Bush, it happened with Donald Trump, and it happened one other time before that in the 1800s, but we're not worried about it. And 2 states split their electoral votes. They each have 3 electoral votes. Maine and Nebraska, the winner gets 2 and the loser gets 1, because they're respecting the losing votes. The president is the head of the government. They are the chief executive officer. They are in charge of the military. Their title for that is commander in chief. They're the chief diplomat of the State Department. They are in charge of espionage through the NSA and the CIA. They're in charge of law enforcement through the FBI. They are in charge of the Postal Service and any number of regulatory bodies like the SEC, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Food and Drug Administration, any number of federal agencies. The president is ultimately at the top of that
Can you
organization.
explain some of the regulatory bodies?
Sure, the Securities and Exchange Commission is actually where I work, and that is in charge of regulating stocks, stock trading, any sort of securities. The Environmental Protection Agency was actually founded in the 1970s by Richard Nixon, and it is in charge of protecting the environment, making sure that companies that pollute don't pollute too much. The Food and Drug Administration makes sure that our food is clean, that we, if there are, the nutrition labels on the sides of anything you buy that tells you how many calories you have and all of the ingredients in the food, that's because the Food and Drug Administration requires it. The president's power in these, because he doesn't really oversee any of the day-to-day operations of any of these. What he really does is appoint the heads of each of them. And any appointments he makes have to be approved by the Senate. This is another one of those checks and balances. So if he appoints the head of the FBI or the Department of Defense, the Senate gets to interview them. We just saw this happening in the last few weeks when, what's his name, Gester, got interviewed by the Senate, and the Senate will approve him, and once he's approved, then he can be the head of the military. The president also has veto power over any bill passed by Congress. So if Congress passes a law and the president says, "I don't like that," then he can just cross it out and say that is not a law. He has the power to effectuate laws passed by Congress, which means that if Congress passes a bill providing funding for schools, then the president can create the Department of Education to decide how that money is doled out, how that money is distributed to the individual schools. And usually it goes through the states. We've heard a lot about executive orders in the last few days. An executive order is used by the president to bypass the bureaucracy of Congress. If, let's say, the president has the power to create the Department of Education, if he decides something related to that bill or to any bill, he can effectuate it with an executive order. And as long as it's not in conflict with any law passed by Congress or the U.S. Constitution, and the reason I'm doing this is because there's a hierarchy of those laws. At the very top is the U.S. Constitution, then it's the laws passed by Congress, and then here are the executive orders. We've heard about a lot of different executive orders, and I'm sure there's a couple questions about those. But the important thing to note about executive orders is that the next president can undo them with a stroke of the pen. Just as easily as Trump signed 200 executive orders, they can all be undone by the next president. And if Congress doesn't provide funding for them, nothing's going to happen, because at the end of the day, everything runs on money. Yeah.
Okay, so didn't Biden bypass Congress to continue to get weapons and all that, and did things not above the belt?
So executive orders have been used by Biden in order to provide, as far as I know, to provide weapons and funding to the Israeli government. But one of the Biden's administration also had an executive order creating sanctions on Israeli settlers who have assets in the United States.
Which Trump just undid.
Which Trump just undid with another executive order.
Yeah, but didn't he not follow the chain to get the funding with Congress, to send the money, weapons and money?
So ultimately, if Congress doesn't provide the funding isn't there. Congress is the only one that can provide money. Sometimes Congress provides money in a big discretionary fund, and the president has the right to decide how to spread that out. But that authorization has to come from Congress in the first place. there's always a little bit of discretion for the president. And when you talk about the federal government, you're talking about billions of dollars. You're not talking about like any small amount of money. So yes, he might have had some, I don't know the details of that specific executive order. But it is likely that he had some funding authorized by Congress in a discretionary fund that he targeted for that reason. Yeah.
So when it comes to policies that don't require funding, for example, like if you wanted to codify, say, Roe v. Wade, or if you wanted to codify anti-discrimination measures, as we just saw with the executive orders where he is attempting to repeal the protections for discrimination against race, gender, etc. Would the executive order then be able to bypass the codification, or no?
So in this, like, let's talk about there's a recent executive order in the last 24 hours that affected DEI offices, diversity, equity, and inclusion offices throughout the federal government. They have all been shut down. This does not require any money. The president has signed this executive order. He is in charge of all of these different offices, and it is his choice to shut down all these offices. It's perfectly legal. There's nothing that is completely above board. If he were to sign an executive order codifying a woman's right to choose, that would be the law of the land. But it would be very, very easily overturned by the next president.
Okay, got it. So even if it does get overturned, the fact that it could be done is to, the fact that it could be done, and let's say in this particular instance wasn't, would be regarded as a deliberate choice as opposed to something that they would have no knowledge of.
Say that one more time.
So, at least in regard to the anti-discrimination and the codification of Roe v. Wade, even if it could possibly have been, could have been overturned, the codification with an executive order, the fact that it could be done still exists. So that if a person doesn't do that, despite, popular support for it, that would then be regarded as a deliberate choice.
Yeah, I mean, the decision to make an executive order or not is up to every single president. And they, in this case, Trump has signed 200 in the last 48 hours. I don't think he knows what he signed. I think they're just putting it in front of him.
America, the what is it, the Gulf of America?
Yeah. Like the real check on this power is the requirement for funding, and the fact that it's not solid. The fact that as soon as you have somebody who disagrees with you, it can be changed very, very easily. Whereas with a law passed by Congress, it would be we just went through that whole process of how to change a congressional law, and that is difficult. It is a bureaucracy meant to not get cut through very easily. It's by design. And at the very, very top of that hierarchy is the U.S. Constitution, which is even harder to change. I want to talk a little bit about martial law, but not too much because it's not that relevant. In times of crises, the president can declare an emergency and temporarily expand their powers. Really, it's about funding, but it's also about taking control of people's rights. It happened during the U.S. Civil War. President Lincoln suspended people's right to know what their charges were when they were arrested. In Hawaii, after Pearl Harbor, that state lived under martial law for a few years. I have something in here that I wrote previously, but just recently, one of the executive orders was declaring a national energy emergency to allow there's a national energy emergency, and it's meant to expand drilling in natural preserved areas. So this use of a national emergency is not something that's unique. It happens a lot. but it oftentimes doesn't affect us in ways that we realize.
More of a helpful example for martial law. 2 months ago, President of Korea called did martial law, and now he's running from the well,
Yeah.
I think it got him.
Yeah, no, this is actually a really interesting example. It's not related to the United States, but in South Korea, I'm sorry, what's your name?
Cameron.
Cameron just told us about,
President Yoon.
yeah, President Yoon was, tried to declare martial law and disband the entire government and take over as essentially a dictator. And the entirety of the South Korean parliament showed up to vote unanimously not to allow it. The military was involved, they were going to arrest the members of their parliament. It turned out not to, it ended up having a happy ending. Martial law didn't take effect. The president is under investigation, and I think you're right, I think he's been arrested at this point, but I'm not sure. But it's a really, really fascinating to see how this process works in other countries. We do have this process of martial law, and it's not just the federal government that declares the national emergencies. In the state, when we have a really bad snowstorm, the governor can declare a state emergency, or after a hurricane, they can declare a state emergency. And what this does is it opens up additional funding so that they can pay the snowplow drivers and pay the repair crews to get out there and without going through the bureaucracy of the state legislature.
Well, Trump does use martial law a lot. Like he threatens to do that whole U.S. military at the borders,
Yeah.
at the college protest.
He's threatened it a lot. So far, as of yet, he hasn't really used it much. But you're right. You're absolutely right. He does threaten it a lot.
He will.
And then even COVID lockdowns, that's another example.
COVID lockdowns are another example of when we instituted a martial law. Yeah. Anybody else? Here we have the face of our current governor. He's elected to a 4-year term. He's not allowed to do more than 2 consecutive terms, so his current term would be his last. After he takes a break, he is allowed to run again, but that doesn't really happen very often. And he's elected by the popular vote. There is no electoral college at the state level for the governor. Similarly, he is the one responsible for appointing the heads of all the different departments of the state of New Jersey. And he also has the right to appoint judges, similar to the president. He has veto powers over anything the state legislature puts forward as well.
He's up for re-election this year.
And this would be his last term.
Yep.
Not for reelection.
Oh, no, sorry, not re-election. He's, yeah, the governor's up for election.
The governor's up for election. He's not going to be running. I think I've been seeing ads for Steve Phillip, who is the mayor of Jersey City. I know there are a lot of other people. Mikey Sherrill's probably also running.
Rashad.
He's the Raz Baraka, I think. Might be
Rashad,
running.
that's what I meant, sorry.
That takes us through the presidency. I want to quickly talk about the courts. The federal courts are granted the power to interpret the law. So Congress writes the law, the president executes the law, and if there's a question as to whether or not it's being executed properly, it's up to the courts to decide that. There is the language that lawyers use is strict construction or loose construction of the law. So, and different judges have different beliefs on how to interpret the law. So a strict constructionist would say that if a law says that no car is allowed to park on this street, but a motorcycle is parked on that street, that motorcycle has every right to be parked on the street because the law said car, not motorcycle. But a loose constructionist might say, no, that car, that they meant, whoever wrote that law probably meant any kind of motor vehicle. And you can see how this same philosophy could be expanded to everything else.
Yeah, there was an argument at the Supreme Court level over the word shall versus must. They said that because they were talking about an incident with the police, and they said that it's indoctrinated that the police that they shall protect and serve, not must protect and serve. So they debated it for 45 minutes. And then at the end of the day, they weren't held accountable, and ever since then, they haven't had to be accountable.
This is also a good opportunity to talk about, we talk a lot about a woman's right to choose in this presentation, but I wanted to talk briefly about where that right comes from, because it was never codified into law. Roe v. Wade was a court case, and it was appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided that the U.S. Constitution didn't say it outright, but they said in the shadows and penumbras of the Constitution, they found a right to privacy. And that right to privacy was originally found to protect married couples' right to obtain birth control in the state of Connecticut. Later it was found to apply to a woman's right to choose what to do with her pregnancy. Later it was found to apply to the right of a couple to be in an interracial marriage. And again, later it was found to apply to the right of same-sex couples to get married. So this right of privacy, even though it doesn't exist in the Constitution, because of a loose construction of the Constitution, has been found to apply to lots of different areas of American life, and it's been the source of a lot of controversy. This is one of the reasons why it was never put into law since the 1970s, was because people felt confident that it was codified in the Constitution because of the Supreme Court's interpretation. Now we're seeing that it's not. And because this right to privacy has been found to be illegitimate by the current Supreme Court, all of those other rights that I just mentioned, the right to birth control, the right to interracial marriage, and the right to same-sex marriage are all up in the air. The judges on the federal bench, every single judge from the district courts to the Supreme Court, are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, by the same process as the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State. And the judges serve a lifetime term. They are there until they retire or pass away. They are in charge of any cases related, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so those are the only two ways a judge would be forced to resign their seat, through retirement or death. There's no way to there would be no incident where they can just be forcibly removed.
So in practice, there hasn't been a necessity to do that. There's nothing written in the Constitution to allow for that. In theory, they could be impeached, but generally when a federal judge is facing criminal charges or corruption scandal, they'll step down. It's happened in the past. And sometimes they don't step down and we forget about it. We've seen that happen with the current Supreme Court in the last few years.
Yep.
Clarence Thomas, Sam Alito. My intention isn't to be political with this presentation, but I have my own beliefs.
Yeah. 501c3.
So the federal courts are, they have jurisdiction. They hear cases related to any sort of federal laws or the U.S. Constitution. They'll also hear any cases where a state is one of the parties in a lawsuit. So let's say you're suing the state of New Jersey. You can sue them in the federal courts. And any case where you're suing somebody in a different state, you can sue them in federal court. But in that case, the federal court will try to apply state law. We're getting into the nitty-gritty here, but I wanted to make sure. Does anybody have any questions about the federal courts before I go to the next slide? No? All right. So there are 94 district courts in total. Every state has at least one. New Jersey only has one. They are regional in nature. The idea is that you shouldn't have to travel too far to get to your courthouse. New York has 4. Pennsylvania has 3. Washington, D.C. is its own district. D.C. stands for the District of Columbia. And they are the trial level. They have 1 judge per case. The circuit courts are appellate courts. There's 13 of them. New Jersey is in the 3rd Circuit, which includes Pennsylvania, Delaware, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. They hear cases as a tribunal, so 3 judges to a case. And if you are unhappy with the decision of the appellate court, you have the right to try to appeal it to the U.S. Supreme Court, although they don't have to hear it, and chances are they won't. There are 9 judges on the U.S. Supreme Court. They hear all the cases together. You need 4 judges to agree to hear a case at all, and they are the final say on the interpretation of the law and the U.S. Constitution. And any rulings they make are supposed to be consistent with previous rulings, which is why recent changes have been so jarring for a lot of people. Any questions? The state has its own court system. Superior Court is the trial court. It's based in the county seat, so there's 21 of them, and it's the trier of fact. So the trier of fact means that they decide what happened. The appellate division, if there was a mistake made in how the judge interpreted the law, the appellate division can reverse that. And if you are unhappy with the appellate division's decision, you can appeal it to the New Jersey Supreme Court, which has the final say in New Jersey laws and the New Jersey Constitution. If it's in conflict with federal law, then it could be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. But again, remember that the federal law sets the floor, and if the New Jersey law has if the New Jersey courts are granting more rights, then the federal courts can't take them away, as long as those rights are found under the New Jersey Constitution or the New Jersey law. And the way our judges are set up, they have a 7-year term, and then they can be reconfirmed after those 7 years to a lifetime appointment. But the lifetime appointment ends at age 70. Our judges have a mandatory retirement age at age 70. Many other states elect their judges. I personally think that's an inferior program, but feel free to disagree with me. There's problems with both. Any questions on New Jersey state courts? All right, I was talking previously about some checks and balances in the system. Just going through some of them quickly. Congress has the power of the purse to check the presidency, and the president has veto power over Congress. Court appointments are made by the president and approved by the Senate. So you need both of their input on who's in charge of all of these different departments and all of these different judges. There's a famous quote from Andrew Jackson, who's the guy on the $20 bill. He lost a lawsuit in the Supreme Court related to the rights of Native Americans to return to land that they owned. And he said John Marshall, who was the Supreme Court of the Justice of Supreme Court of the Supreme Court at the time. I'm sorry, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time. He said John Marshall has made his decision, now let him go enforce it. Basically saying, I don't care what he said, I'm going to do what I want anyway. And that is an example of how the court checks the president. And the biggest check on the president is probably the impeachment of the president, which is when the House of Representatives gets together and says, we think you committed a crime. And remember, Trump was impeached twice last time he was the president, but neither time was the impeachment confirmed by the Senate. If it had been confirmed by the Senate either of those 2 times, he would have been removed from office, and his vice president, Mike Pence, would have been the president.
So why wasn't it confirmed?
In the Senate with the Republican majority.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right. So that's it for the presentation. I'm happy to take any other questions. I know I've been talking for a while, but I'm happy to answer any questions. God bless you.
Great.
Yeah.
Where would I be able to access these slides?
I
If
can.
you share them with me, I can share them to
Yeah, I
everyone.
wanted to ask if you can forward it to our emails or something.
Of
Yeah,
course.
so if you put your email address by your name on the sign-in sheet, I'm happy to, or you put your email, and I'll be happy to, anyone whose email's on the sign-in sheet, I'll be happy to forward these slides over to you as well.
I'm happy to do.
If there are, I would love to hear takeaways too from the presentation as well, like some of the things that, you know, we feel like we learned in this presentation, or,
Very interested into future presentations, like other topics.
yeah, absolutely, and like, I don't wanna jump in here.
No, it's okay.
And like, what are some of the things, well, first, do you have any questions about what it is that we discussed, or he discussed, not we, but yeah. What are some of the things that we would like to take a deeper dive into?
So kind of selfishly, I'd like to learn how to propose bills and write bills more. I know Clifton's assembly people and the senator they're up for re-election, so they're gonna be showing their face at more events. I'm looking for more of these, like, little trophies to add to their resume, you know?
I'm just writing it down. How to propose bills and write bills?
Yeah.
Two things, if that's cool to share.
Yeah.
So the first would be on the process of immigration, how we can protect like immigration rights and
Process of immigration and how to protect
the
immigrants?
process, yeah. And the second would be about the formation of political parties. What goes into it, how they are maintained, how they fall apart, things like that.
I like that.
I'd like to know how to influence senators to do an arms embargo, because I belong to an organization that we went to meet Senator Booker, and he's very pro-Israel, and it was very hard for him. It's very hard to convince somebody who's already made up his mind, and voters' decisions doesn't seem to have an impact on him. So I'd just like to know more about how to reach my senators and my governor and my congressman so that, you know, we get them to do things.
Senator Booker will be up for re-election, not this year, but in the following year. So this year it's the Assembly, the following year it's the Senate. So what I would say now, because is the best thing to do, is we need to start finding people that we want to support in the Assembly or, you know, or anywhere that we want to help encourage to go into that position. Because the best way is to jeopardize their job. Thank you so much. The best way is to jeopardize their jobs. And that happens through voting. And that's why the voting, like, and the piece of it is too, like, everybody has a score. So based off how often you vote and on the local elections, they're more likely to hear what you have to say. And like as Booker didn't wake up as like somebody who was a supporter of Israel. Booker was somebody who was petitioned early and often. And they also, in his office building, they also there is the New Jersey Israel commission. There's like the state office for Israel. It's also in that same building with him and now Andy Kim as well. And I don't have all the answers, but what I will say is like people power is a real thing. And if we can continue to show that we're mobilizing and that we're growing in numbers, then we can start to persuade. But we need to show that we're growing in numbers. And we need to be consistent. And we need to be organized. And to be organized means to move in step with one another. So just by being here today, by being dialed into an organization, that's part of it. So when we have to celebrate, because so much of this is meant to make us feel hopeless, we have to find ways to gain wins and celebrate those wins. So acting together is a win, and we're going to keep doing that. But yeah, it's about also, we did an organizing class. I'll do another one again in the future on how to invite others into the movement and continuing to build that people power. And we also work in coalition with other orgs as well. So it's a lot of bridge building.
I have a question based upon newborns in the country by illegals. So isn't that part of the Constitution where, I mean, he's
I can, so this is something that is definitely in conflict with the Constitution. It is definitely going to be appealed. There's going to be a lawsuit, it's going to be appealed, it's going to end up in front of the Supreme Court. Your guess is as good as mine, what the Supreme Court is going to say about it. But it is, in my opinion, very, very, very directly against what's in the Constitution.
Yeah, I thought so. I was surprised. Is that something that he can just get away with and sign off on?
Well, this is how the checks and balances work. But when all three branches of the government are all in the same club, when they're all working together, then they can get away with what they want.
And is that what we currently have? It's a Republican Congress, a Republican president? and-
Yeah,
And a Republican Supreme Court,
yeah.
So it's all Republican, all three branches.
all three branches.
Correct.
That's why it's important to vote.
Yeah, and I see the government and like the media and what we hear is kind of like a word problem. Like some of like he said, like he signed over 200 executive orders. That is like meant to intimidate us and feel like we're getting steamrolled, but not every one of them is gonna stick. But this is, I always say that the biggest thing that we can do is like really focus on your community, because that's where you build strength. Like we were meant to learn. There's a reason why in our education system we don't teach civics. Like there's a reason why it's not like as accessible, and it's because if we continue to distract ourselves with the federal government, we feel powerless. But you get your mind right, you get your family right, then you get your community right, and that's how you change the world. So we have things at risk here that will directly affect us, and the assembly is a part of that. But that's also why we fight for representation. That's why we look for community leaders within our own communities to uplift and put into those positions, because they understand our experience. And so that's how we, and like Puya mentioned earlier, it took a very long time for APAC to become what it became. It didn't happen in a few years, it happened over the course of 100 years. So it's not, it's about, this is why I always encourage people to bring their children to the civic engagement events, because over time, the more you hear, it's a language barrier. You might not understand, even if you understood 5% of what happened today, that's a good thing, because the more you hear the language, the more you're gonna understand it. And this is what politics is, it's a language barrier. So it's about the repetition, and I recommend listening, I like to listen to a lot of Supreme Court cases, because that helps me understand the law better. And those are all online and they're all accessible. And there are a lot of state websites with a lot of resources. So those are all things that, there's all of the Supreme Court cases that are online. You can listen to all of them. And it helps you better understand politics and the laws as a whole. So it's just it's a practice, and it's getting healthy. It's a regular thing. You're not gonna vote once every 4 years and then it's gonna change things. It's about showing up to everything early and often. And it's not just about voting, right? Like if we're talking about strictly about the liberation of Palestinians, which is centered in everything that we do, it's not just about voting. It's about voting. It's about boycotting. It's about protesting. It is about educating ourselves. It's about educating others, because now you're having a multi-pronged approach, and now we're creating pressures on all sides. And then it's about doing what you know. Like Puya came up to me and said, I want to do this. I want to teach this class at the center. It's about what's your thing, and bring that to the table, because we all have something that we're really good at, and all of that can come together and protect the community. And I don't just mean the Palestinian community. I mean Clifton, Patterson, Passaic County, New Jersey,
The United States.
the United States.
I mean, yeah. Preach.
But we can't forget that.
Kind of a question and also a takeaway. All of this is subject to change, I'm assuming, over the next year or two.
Yeah.
Give or take.
Change is the only thing that's guaranteed, they say. The only thing that's guaranteed is change.
I'll say this, I gave you an outline of how the government is supposed to work.
Okay.
And it is flawed in a lot of ways. It doesn't always work the way it's supposed to. Honestly, I gave you a lot of information. There are certain members of Congress, I wouldn't be surprised if you now know more than they do. Because there are some people who sit in those seats that don't really have a lot of respect for the institutions, and are happy to do whatever they can to subvert them.
Then a question, how often does Congress meet? Because I know there's always talk about like congressional sessions.
Yeah. So generally, they are in DC 6 months of the year, and they're in their home state the other 6 months, or they're supposed to be. And the idea is that while they're in their home state, they're talking to their constituents, they're talking to the people that they represent, and when they're in DC, they're working towards passing the bills on behalf of the people they represent. There are some members of Congress who live in a different state than the state they represent. That happens. It is frowned upon, but it's not illegal.
Here it happens.
A couple other things too. Remember, America is very young. Like as a country, there are nations that have been around a lot longer than us. And what it was founded by a group of like how young were the people who wrote the Constitution?
Oh, yeah.
Like it's not so I really think it's about like grabbing hold of our power and taking charge of it and realizing that we have to manage up. Which is why when like we call you or have my grassroots organizing team call you and be like, hey, we're gonna take this meeting in your district. Can you join us for the meeting? Even if you feel like you have nothing to say in the meeting, being a body in that virtual room, just being in that space as a constituent helps add weight to the things that we're organizing around. So like these calls, people like even if it's not our organization, when organizers call you, we're not trying to annoy you guys or like disrupt you guys. It's about bridging the divide between information and like real-time initiatives that are happening so that we can continue to work together as a community to take our power back from our government, because let's be honest, we've lost a lot of it. And like it's time for us to take our power back, and that's gonna happen through building our base and strengthening our base.
Question for the Assemblyman specifically. So in your opinion, when it comes to fighting for the things that we need and also for the things that we want on the state and federal level, would you say that it requires both knowledge of the law but also creativity in particular when it comes to enforcing the law and how we abide to the standards and quorum? To what degree would you say that like creative enforcement and engagement, how important would you say that is?
Yeah, so I would encourage you to always be aware of who you're approaching. So if you're worried about something related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, obviously you want to reach out to members of Congress because they are your access to anything related to foreign policy. If you are trying to change something at the state level, then you want to reach out to your assemblyman because they are much more accessible and they are much more better equipped to affect change at the state level. So it's just that's actual knowledge of the law is helpful, but less important, because once you find somebody to advocate for you, in this case it would be your representatives, it is they're the ones who have the expertise.
Any other questions or takeaways?
I have a question.
Of course.
So I feel like the last elections didn't go well because of the political, the candidates that won got a lot of political contributions, a lot of money, and the ones that didn't win didn't get half the money to promote themselves. So is there anything in the works to limit political contributions?
Yeah. Campaign finance restrictions and campaign finance regulations are incredibly popular across party lines. Everybody thinks that they should have some sort of limits on how much you spend to gain influence. There is a Supreme Court case that says that paying money for access is akin to freedom of speech, which sounds awful. And another Supreme Court case said that if you want to pool your money with other people in a political action committee, a PAC, not this PAC, a different PAC, but if you want to create a political action committee, you are free to do so and use that money to create the biggest soapbox you can in order to make your views heard and to promote the candidates that you think should win. This has also been used by people who already have a lot of money to funnel money towards candidates secretly.
So also, let's think about it.
The law is currently that anybody can do anything.
But also, if you think about it in terms of local politics too, like we're all like living. You're probably connected to more people than you realize, and you don't need money to speak to the people that in your network. One of the things that happened in 2020 during the primaries, a lot of these campaigns started moving into relational organizing, meaning like I have 36 people in my group chat. Like that's a network of mine that I could tap into, and that by having interactions constantly and like locally, you can sway elections. You don't need the money. You just need to have the people power. People power will outdo it as long as we're not getting so distracted with like it's just like I think it's about small consistent efforts.
Well,
You-
I guess my question was, why isn't there anything in the works to limit funding? Because wouldn't that be the best way to have it?
I don't disagree with you.
Yeah,
But the
absolutely.
people who are in charge of limiting the funding also benefit greatly from the system being in place the way it is,
Mhm.
because they are the ones who are receiving all these campaign contributions.
But everyone's corrupt, basically.
It's corruption.
Pretty much.
Would it be difficult to, I know APAC has some totally out of the box, but APAC does exist. How difficult would it be, especially this day and age, to build something similar to APAC to maybe a competition towards APAC and say, hey.
It depends how much money you want to put into it.
Yeah.
So you get.
But that's what APAC does, right? APAC
Right.
funds these candidates.
Correct.
And the way they will fund every single member of Congress, they'll give up to the limit of whatever directly to the candidates, and then they will give to their opponents also, and then whoever ends up in the seat ends up supporting them, and then they will also put ads promoting their own message. They'll take members of Congress on vacations also. It's a lot of money. There's a lot of money.
So do you believe that they're loyal to the money, not the cause?
Oh, yeah.
Well,
They're paid.
I'm sure there are some people who are true believers, right? I'm sure there are some people who believe very, very strongly one way or the other. But at the end of the day, I'm cynical. I think that they are much more loyal, like you said, to the money than to the cause.
But this is also why we focus on the assembly, because those are people who are eventually could become senators, governors, congresspeople. If you build the relationships early on when they're still reachable, then the hope is that they will advocate for you. So it's about building the relationships with these politicians early on in their careers. And then we're also, yeah.
So I guess like Booker kind of fell through the cracks there.
Most of them do.
Yeah.
I'll say this: when
Well, Booker, I don't really think Newark really liked him as much as we think that Newark liked him, because there were a lot there was. Booker became sensationalized after the Kavanaugh hearings. Like Booker, people started really, really loving Booker because of the way that him and Kamala were responding during the Kavanaugh hearings. People saw him as like this young champion. But I think that a lot of these people get into power because a few people pay attention to them that are active locally versus the majority of people who are inactive.
And I'll say this about lobbyists. First, some of them do serve a function, right? If you're a member of Congress, you're not an expert on everything. So you need people to educate you on certain things. And when a lobbyist comes in and is granted access because they contributed to a campaign or for whatever reason, they have the right to educate you on whatever the topic is. Part of the problem is that the people educating our politicians aren't hearing the full story. They're being educated by groups like this.
And the party, Booker is part of the Democratic Party in New Jersey. What I mean by that is like the party really helped push him through. So it wasn't so much that the people helped push Booker through. It was more the Democratic Party helped push Booker through, which is why we want to regain control of that by being active earlier, rather like paying attention to these people early on, like literally like city council, board of ed level, like anyone who has any opportunity in getting elected, catching them early and following them. And the point of following them is so that when they're not doing what it is that they promised you, you don't give them a job again. You don't re-elect them. So that these ways, so that the hope is so that there starts to be some form of accountability. But it is 8:45, so I don't want to hold everyone here. I know it's getting later, so if anyone has any questions, and we can hang out for a little bit. But if you guys can help by putting your chairs away, keep in mind that we have other events coming up. Please keep an eye on everything we have coming. And then if anyone is open to me just asking them a few questions for like our social, I would love to hear some takeaways so that we can continue. The chairs can go this way, so that we can continue to invite other people